huge harm to deep state, some deep state elements, and otherwise I couldn't imagine. I mean, most probably someone would have been killed during this campaign, and we had it relatively quite peaceful way. I mean, so there is significant progress. There is no doubt about it. Thanks.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Any people in the audience? Anybody in the audience who would like to raise a question, objection, a comment on this so far? I know there's a lot of ground to cover on just Turkish domestic issues alone, so we cannot go into the depth maybe that we would all like, but that's the reality in a busy town and busy people. Any other comments on that then? All right, well, why don't we then move on to the foreign policy arena. Obviously, foreign and domestic policies are linked. So we will probably refer back and forth, and we have already a bit. But I'd like to begin with some discussion of the Foreign Minister Davutoglu, Ahmet Davutoglu, and his foreign policy vision and the extraordinary change that I think has taken place in Turkey. I would, in fact, say that what we are witnessing now in Turkish foreign policy is the greatest shift really since the founding of the Turkish Republic. Turkey has gone from a country that was essentially with the new Kemalist period and the founding of a nation state and the loss of the empire, there was a deliberate and probably wise effort to back away from all the former imperial possessions of the Ottoman Empire and to focus on building a Turkish nation state. But this led to very artificial relationships in many respects, because it meant that there were almost no ties with the Arab world. There were very few ties between Turkey and the Muslim world in general. Russia, the Soviet Union, was an enemy. So in effect, Turkey was looking only to the West in a very artificial way, I would say, because all countries in theory deal with all the countries around them. But for decade after decade, Turkey was only looking to the West. So, furthermore, the other revolutions, as you know, of this Kemalist period was not only the adoption of Turkish nationalism, but it was a suppression, to some extent, of the Muslim identity of Turkey. Turkey wanted to be an ethnic state, ethnically based, whereas that Islam was not to be an important part of the national identity, and a cutting of the ties with the Turkish past. Indeed, even the abolition of the caliphate, which was, we read about this in the West as one of the many reforms of Kemal, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, but I don't think we understand quite the impact for the Muslim world that this event meant. It is, in effect, as if the Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi got up tomorrow morning and decided to abolish the papacy with no discussion with anybody. Whatever we may think of that. So, I mean, obviously there would be a great many Catholics around the world who would have something to say and to think about if the Prime Minister of Turkey, of Italy, were to abolish the papacy. Anyway, just to give you an idea of this. Also, in the early Kemalist period, there was a very good concept. One of the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's slogans, "Yurtta sulh, cihanda sulh," peace at home and peace abroad. This was really very important. It really did. It was an early idea of what I would argue Turkey has now come back to with the present Davutoglu policy, and I'll say a few more words in that in a minute. But between that late Kemalist period and up to maybe 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Turkey was almost, was a loyal ally of the West. It did what Washington wanted. It wanted to be identified with Washington and with NATO. There was really very little independent thinking in Turkish foreign policy. That began to change as, even in the 60s and 70s, Turkey became uncomfortable with American support or lack of sufficient support it felt on issues like Cyprus or Greece or Russia. But I think and finally, just before the AKP came to power, even Ecevit himself began to talk about the necessity for improved relations with all its neighbors. This was a small point in his agenda, but this was picked up by Davutoglu, who had been writing and thinking about this issue as a professor for a very long time. His book is a remarkable one. It's called Strategic Depth, Turkey's Place in the World. Türkiye'nin Ulusal Konumu. It's a long book, it's a complicated book, it's a difficult book. It ranges back and forth from like Arnold Toynbee in past history and interpretations of history and Turkey's role and the Ottoman role and the Turkish role and the Islamic role and the ties with Africa and with the Arab world and the Middle East and the Balkans. It's a comprehensive vision, very inconsistent, a lot of room. But a remarkable book, probably the most significant book ever written in Turkey on foreign policy in many ways in terms of its breadth. Sadly, has not yet been translated into English. But anyway, the key points of this, and I think some of you know this well, was that Turkey reinforced the idea that Turkey is a player in all of these regions. It's a Western state, it's a European state, it's a potential member of EU, it's Mediterranean, it's Balkan, it's Caucasian, it's Middle Eastern, it's Black Sea, it's Caspian, it's Central Asian, it's Eurasian, and even ties with Africa that have been grown markedly in that period. So this is a huge change. Most of the rest of the world that Turkey hardly acknowledged existed. It's sort of like the U.S. thinks about Canada and Mexico. It doesn't really believe that these countries exist. Turkey, I think, also tended not to look at those parts of the world as quite real, or if they were real, they were dangerous, and they were potentially enemy. The second and striking point was Davutoglu's declaration of a move towards a zero enemies policy or zero problem policy with its neighbors. Huge change. Turkey up to then had been if not an enemy, yes. Surrounded by enemies, internal, external, and they played off each other, which promoted the role of the military on top of this. And suddenly, with almost a stroke of a pen, there was an effort to improve relations with everybody. Now, granted, the end of the Soviet Union made this much, much easier. Turkey had been an enemy of Russia and vice versa for hundreds of years. Turkey, after the fall of the Soviet Union, didn't even border on Russia anymore. But nonetheless, the relations with Russia have been transformed, and Alexander Jackson will be speaking on some of those issues. With all of its neighbors, the relations have been startlingly transformed in many ways that the United States has been very uncomfortable with, because the U.S. has had, particularly in the previous administration, many enemies in that area, and Turkey was beginning to deal with those enemies. Hamas and Iran and Syria and other states in the region that made Washington quite uncomfortable. But nonetheless, this is a very important element in thinking about political science in general. I think this is a broad issue. What happens if a state declares that we will have zero enemies? Obviously, the world does not change overnight. Human beings don't change their character overnight, but nonetheless, it suggests a different way of thinking about the world and neighbors, and not putting those who are friends, allies, which is a term I'm sometimes uncomfortable with because it means sometimes you own the ally, or friends, or enemies, or it's nice if you can do away with some of these categories as long as possible. So that's very dramatic change. I would say that another key point is Davutoglu's determination that Turkey serve as an intermediary among conflicting parties. Not just because this is nice, but because nobody wants to live in a region that is filled with tensions and war. So Turkey volunteered itself for working on the Arab-Israeli problem. Washington preferred to maintain that monopoly all by itself. It has tried to work between Israel and